The reading talked about how The Death of Art wasn't really an accurate title, and it was more about the end of a narrative. And the narrative had been going in a very linear pattern, and it seemed to me that the pattern that it was following was one of destroying the old and trying to create something completely different and new. So this kind of rejection of the old was kind of like how Romanticism, when it came along, it was like totally rejecting how everyone was trying to be rational and reasonable and very like definite shapes and lines and things, and then the Romantics were like, oh, we're just gonna follow our feelings and we're gonna do whatever we want and break all the rules. Same happened with like realism. They were breaking all the rules of the academy. And so this kind of rule breaking and like setting a new thing, and like cubism, which was completely random and weird, just trying to completely reject the old generation and make its new thing and move forward that way. And yet that kind of doesn't work over a long period of time, because after this narrative that was talked about in the reading is very long. It spans centuries. So there's only so many times you can reject the old and make something new before you have to repeat something, because there's only so many things you can do with art, even though there's many things you can do with art, but at a certain point you have to start recycling. They were saying the radical theorists in the 80s thought that advanced painting showed signs of internal exhaustion, like the all-white paintings of Robert Ryman and the monotonous stripes of Daniel Buren. And so this seemed to show that it was marking the end, that they couldn't really go further without using some of the ideas that were in other movements before them. So it kind of reminds me of Van Gogh, who he was considered the most original artist, but how he learned to do things was by copying everything, and by like copying Japanese prints and the other artists that were in Europe at the time. And people thought he came up with really, really original and unique things, even though he was completely copying and just putting together other ideas, rather than the typical rejection of the old ideas and making something new. In the reading, it was discussed how in the movies about ancient Greece, having Americans trying to look Greek, they use the cliches such as the curl in front of their forehead to try to make them look Greek. And so for Americans who are used to seeing Americans in movies, they're like, oh, they look really Greek. But to someone in another culture, they were saying, like maybe a French person, it would just look silly, because they're like, look at these Americans trying to be Greek and thinking that just by having a curl it makes them look Greek. And so I was thinking about how other cultures reveal both their cliches and reveal your own cliches, because it's hard to see the cliche when you're existing in the culture. And I discovered this when I was younger and I started reading anime. And it was interesting because after reading a couple, at first it seems really new and interesting, but then you realize what the Japanese cliches are, and then you realize that a lot of the books and a lot of the anime are the same, and it's the same story over and over, and it's a completely different cliche than American books and movies. And so then it kind of made me more aware of the cliches in American books and movies, and more like realizing it, but it had only been obvious to me when I saw it in another culture. This reading was definitely disturbing and brought a few questions that I can't really answer, but especially reading about the guy who was tortured and killed by being thrown in the river. I'm someone who doesn't even like to watch horror movies, so those kind of horrible events and people in extreme pain really bothers me a lot. And it's not something that I want to look at all, and I wouldn't want to see photos of it, and I wouldn't want to hear about it or anything. But it also kind of brings up the question of how important it is to still look at things like that, just to put things in perspective, because when you're really upset about something in your own life, but then you see really horrible events, it kind of makes you realize that there's something more important to worry about, and that you should definitely be helping these bigger problems in the world than just worrying about really small-scale things. But then it kind of also brings up the point of, is it just making us more apathetic? Because then if you see all of these horrible images all the time, then if you completely only think those are important and then don't really focus on the tiny problems that are at hand, then you kind of lose track of things. And if you're not good at solving problems small scale, then you're never going to be good at solving problems large scale. So it's kind of a tricky situation with no right answer. Beauty has to do a lot with what you've seen in your lifetime and what your society is telling you. And it says that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and one person can think something's beautiful at one point in their life and then even as soon as a week later or a minute later decide that it's ugly. When thinking about beauty, how what I thought was beautiful when I was a kid is very different from what I think is beautiful now. And when I was younger, I pretty much only looked at faces because that's what I like to draw, and so people with beautiful faces were who I considered beautiful. And then as I got older, I started to look for different things as well, and that kind of changed my perception of who was beautiful, and also like who other people would say was beautiful, or other things that people would say was beautiful. Like, I didn't really used to like fall as the season, but my best friend actually wrote a song about how beautiful fall was, and I kind of started to notice it as not just the sign that winter was coming, but actually something very pretty.